Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second SGRN School of Gender, Race, and Nation Brown Bag Speaker Series event. We're just going to wait a few minutes and let a few more people log on, and we'll get started in a couple minutes. All right? Thank you. Hi, everybody, again. And, well, I'm really excited. Really excited to be here today for the second School of Gender, Race, and Nations Brown Bag Speaker Series event. Today, our event features Professor Callie Simmons from Indigenous Nation Studies. I just wanted to also let everybody know, and those of you who were here last month in December, we had, who's in our audience with us, Professor Molly Benitez, and they presented on, well, the title of their talk was Metabolize Hate or Die of It, Lowered Labor and Critical Affect Theory. So, and this is our second event. Just wanted to say, the purpose of the SGRN Brown Bag really is just to generate a space where we can learn about each other's work. I mean, it's much more than that, but I don't want to go on and on. But so that's what we're trying to do, is create some energy around the work that we do in SGRN, and also we're just featuring many of the cluster hire people who came in this year. This event is happening once a month, and it's alternating Wednesday to Thursday each month. So this month it's Thursday. I'll say that later. But so I want to introduce our speaker, and we'll get started. So today our speaker is Professor Callie Simmons. The title of their talk is To Refuse to Die: Resistant Indigeneity in Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians. Callie Simmons holds a PhD in English from the University of California, Riverside, and she is an assistant professor of Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University. An Indigenous feminist scholar of Oglala, did I say that right?
Yep.
Okay. Oglala Lakota descent. Her work examines depictions of North American Native peoples in film and literature with an emphasis on the genres of horror and speculative fiction. Her research has appeared in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Science Fiction, Film, and Television, and she has a chapter on horror and indigeneity in the forthcoming collections, Weird Fiction, A Companion. I just want to thank Callie for being willing to do this. I'm really excited. So please come up and do your presentation. Yay! All
right, howdy everybody. Thanks for coming. I have a little audience here, and then we have some folks on Zoom. So to start, oh no, have I abolished the clicky? I'll just do it this way. Oh no. Okay, so to start, I want to give a land acknowledgement and accompanying call to action. So Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Hayash Teshk, and that's the Chinook name for the Columbia River. I just want to thank Carly Lodish for teaching me that word. It's important for us to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of their sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And I want to, in the spirit of the work of Kutcha Riesling Baldi, offer a sort of accompanying call to action with this land acknowledgement. So working and living on this land as an uninvited Indigenous guest compels me to offer my support to the Chinook Nation, and they're currently seeking donations to fund community aid, language, and cultural revitalization. And so I ask each of you to consider joining me in this work. You can give donations to the Chinook Nation on the website chinooknation.org. Additionally, they're trying to get some footing on Twitter, so you can follow them there on Twitter as well. So before I begin, I also just want to offer my thanks to Ethan, to Josh, to Darrow and all their work in coordinating all this, the folks who keep the lights on and will clean this room after we all leave, right? I'm really humbled by this opportunity to share my work and to hear all of your questions and feedback. So, woohoo! Can I do it now? Hooray! All right, we've done it. So, the violent processes of settlement in the United States have given rise to a nation built upon indigenous dispossession and the stolen labor of enslaved Black peoples. Acts of settler conquest and the systems of domination which they are premised upon have placed us, to use Christina Sharp's terminology, in the wake of many ships. In addition to facilitating the movement of stolen chattel slaves across the Atlantic, ships also transported colonialism's settler agents. And these settlers would go on to commit unspeakable acts of genocidal violence against Black and Indigenous peoples in the name of so-called civilization and progress. According to Sharp, to exist in the wake of these vessels is to, quote, occupy and be occupied by the continuous and changing present of slavery's as yet unresolved unfolding. And to riff off this idea, I would add that we're also caught up in the wake of settler colonialism's present and as of yet unresolved unfolding. So I'm also impelled by Sharp's description of the ways anti-Blackness manifests as, quote, a dysgraphia of disasters which arrive by the way of rapid, deliberate, repetitive, and wide circulation on television and social media of Black social, material, and psychic death, end quote. And in reading this claim about the dysgraphic ways that the wake shapes our methods of storying our past, present, and future, I hear the reverberations of the work of Audra Simpson, a Kanawake Mohawk scholar. So, in her monograph, Mohawk Interruptus, Simpson writes that many of the ethnographies produced about the Mohawk peoples and the peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were and are profoundly shaped by an assumption of, quote, the inevitability of the decline of the death of indigeneity. And as such, these works embody an imperative to write in ways that serve to, quote, contain, to fetishize, and to trap indigenous discourses into memorizable, repeatable rituals for preservation against a social and political death which was foretold but did not happen, end quote. And so I'm struck by the way that Simpson describes how stories about Indigenous peoples unfold out of settler logics of enclosure and elimination. And I desire to term this as anti-indigeneity's dysgraphia of disasters, as one way to place Sharp and Simpson's thinking in conversation. Both are thinking about the ways conquest has profoundly shaped the conventions of Western thinking, seeing, and writing, albeit each examines these conventions, how these conventions articulate out in different communities. And so bringing these works together inspires me to argue that what Sharp calls wake work involves learning to recognize the conventions of colonialism's distorted storying of Black and Indigenous life, as well as resisting and reinscribing these dysgraphic narratives. And so both of these moves, I argue, can be achieved by taking up Simpson's call to turn away from a politics of recognition and towards one of refusal. Undertaking this method of refusal asks us to reject the forms of recognition, legibility, and equivocation which settler institutions extend as the only possible spaces of articulation. Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang state that refusal can involve, quote, refusing to share sensational interview data, refusing to search for the subjectivity of the other, refusing the God gaze of the objective knower, refusing to draw conclusions about communities, and instead choosing to write instead about power in the form of institutions, policy, and research itself, end quote. And so refusal for me is a method which can help us to slow down our readings and our looks and our thinking, and in this way disrupt the narrative conventions which settler colonialism invites us to so glibly repeat. And what I find so compelling and important about the methodology of refusal is that refusal is not just a simple no, but rather it is a response which, in its sometimes silent demand for something else, can make visible other routes, paths, or modes of articulation. And so Tuck and Yang explain in the same article that, quote, in teaching and learning refusal, we often turn towards art to give language to the intuitive, using art to think or feel through theory, to decode power and uncode communities, trains our intuition. And so in that spirit, for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to turn to Stephen Graham Jones's novel, The Only Good Indians, a text which I argue intervenes into the settler colonial narrative that Indigenous life is always already doomed by staging a series of intrusions, interruptions, and deviations from convention, which I argue are embodiments of this method of refusal. So apologies if you haven't read the novel. I'm about to ruin it all. So hopefully you should still read it afterward. That's great. So to briefly summarize the novel, The Only Good Indians tells the story of Ricky, Lewis, Gabe, and Cass, 4 Blackfoot men who on one fateful afternoon decide to trespass onto their reservation's elders-only hunting territory. Eventually, the group locate a large herd of elk, and proceed to open fire, hoping that in sort of, killing all of these elk, they'll be seen as heroes for packing the community's freezers with meat for the winter. However, before they can make off with their haul, the group are caught by a game warden and subsequently forced to discard the massacred herd, leaving the meat to rot. So 10 years after the wasteful mass slaughter, Elkhead Woman, the shape-shifting revenant spirit of a pregnant elk cow shot by the men during the slaughter, returns to take her revenge on the group and subsequently stalks and murders each of them one by one. And so the novel is composed of 3 interconnected sections which depict each of the men as they go about their daily lives on and around the reservation. And in each of these segments of narrative, readers gain insight into the different ways the characters of Ricky, Lewis, Gabe, and Cass negotiate their guilt over the killing of the elk herd. So while the summary I've provided makes the novel sound like a straightforward revenge story, Jones refuses to reduce the would-be hunters to their actions from that fateful afternoon, instead depicting the group within all of their complexity. Jones does not shy away from showing the shamefulness of the foremen's actions and the effects their choices have had on their families, communities, and other than human kin. Yet Jones does this while carefully showing that these men are in the process of imperfectly navigating a deeply constraining anti-Indigenous world. By refusing to reduce the men to simple agents of willful destruction, Jones exposes the way settler colonialism facilitates Indigenous doom and creates its own alibi by repeatedly storing Native life as inevitably disaster-bound. So one way that Jones enacts refusal in the novel is that he intercuts this sort of primarily third-person narrated novel with various interruptions of new perspectives into the story for the purposes of expressly exposing and critiquing settler narrative conventions. So several newspaper clipping and headline-style segments appear throughout the text, and one even begins the novel when the character Ricky is assaulted by a group of white oil workers. So this is the novel's opening sentence that immediately foretells Ricky's fate. And it says, quote, "The headline for Richard Boss Ribs would be Indian killed in dispute outside bar." That's one way to say it, end quote. So the headline, constructive in the passive voice, conceals the agents of Ricky's murder. Yet as the chapter unfolds, the readers are given more details about Ricky's death, most importantly the role that Elkhead Woman plays in staging the scene of the crime. And we must eventually reckon with this disjunction between how Ricky is murdered and how his murder is later narrated in the newspaper segments. A similar narrative interruption occurs later in the novel when immediately following the killing of Lewis, whose full name is Lewis A. Clark, by Elkhead Woman, the following text appears. 3 dead, 1 injured in manhunt. 4 Shelby men were attacked last night following the apprehension of fugitive Lewis A. Clark, see Wednesday's edition, who had apparently been fleeing back to his tribe's ancestral reservation. Clark was the main suspect of the brutal murders of both his wife and a federal co-worker. The report indicates that this group of 4 hunters had been out all day, aiding in the search for Clark. Representatives for the Highway Patrol say while armed citizen patrols of this sort might seem helpful, staying off the roads is actually more beneficial to recovery and apprehension efforts. Reports that these 4 Shelby men were actually the ones to find Clark, now deceased, are unconfirmed, end quote. And so one of the formal purposes of this segment within the novel is to provide readers with additional details of the events leading to Lewis's death, which are omitted in the chapter preceding the clipping. We don't really end up finding out like what happened after Elkhead Woman appears, and we get some of that in this segment. The title of the clipping places, lost my place. Although one formal purpose of this segment within the novel is to provide readers with additional details of the events leading to Lewis's death, which are omitted in the chapter preceding the clipping, the newspaper clipping also enacts a refusal of colonial narrative conventions by exposing their constrained perspective. So the title of the clipping places emphasis on the 4 vigilantes who pursued Lewis, and the body of the article spends 2 entire paragraphs narrating their actions before finally announcing the event of Lewis's death. The pieces of the article explaining Lewis's murder are ultimately subordinated to the narrative of the vigilantes' murders. This can also be seen in the way Lewis is not recorded in the headline's body count. 3 dead are the vigilantes who attempted to apprehend Lewis. The effect of this omission is that while Lewis is ultimately announced as dead, the language used in the clipping indicates that his death does not count in the same ways the deaths of the vigilantes do. So, the ways that Elkhead Woman stages Ricky and Lewis's murders suggest that she too is aware of the pervasive settler narratives of Indigenous precarity. Elkhead Woman can therefore be understood as a character who takes seriously Cree scholar Billy Ray Belcourt's claim that, quote, one of the conditions of Indigenous life today is manslaughter hidden under the ruse of botched ways of populating the world. And that's from his article, Meditations on Reserve Life. And that's actually, the article is where the phrase "to refuse to die" comes from, and I can talk more about that article in the Q&A. So the ways that Elkhead Woman exploits settler common sense notions of Indigenous precarity are such that she is able to carry out in secret the murders of Lewis, Gabe, and Cass. Like the way she stages these murders actually facilitates people not seeing her as an agent. So an important aspect of these interruptions is how they function to expose colonialism's reiterative mechanisms. Colonialism's disgraphic writing or sort of storying style erases other modes of storying by becoming the only mode of storying imaginable, and in this way can even constrain Indigenous imaginaries. So before he's killed by Elkhead Woman, Lewis engages in a more literal form of misreading in another instance of intrusive refusal. After Elkhead Woman appears in his home and kills his dog, Lewis begins sifting through the evidence of that weekend when the men killed the elk, an event they refer to as the Thanksgiving Classic, in hopes of discovering the identity of the monster who's pursuing him. Jones's novel explicitly frames Lewis's behavior as an act of misreading by providing the reader with the image of a skin marked to prophesize events. So, quote, in the museum behind glass, there's an old winter count drawn on, probably buffalo, Lewis imagines, but why not elk? And who's to say it's all drawn on either? It could be that back when, the people would bring any hides or skins that look different into the old-time version of a postal inspector. Because maybe some hides, some skins, right when they peel back from the meat, there's already some markings, right? A starting point maybe, a story of things to come, a story of winters to come. That day in the snow, the Thanksgiving Classic, there had been too much blood and hurry to wipe the skin clean. And so Lewis imagines and tries to read the signs on the prophetic skin of the elk that he's kept all these years, but it's been marked in such a way that he can't perceive. The back side of the skin is black with freezer burn or something. Lewis isn't sure. He tries to wipe it away with paper towels, but it's in the pores like ink, which he guesses either blows his big theory or proves it, only that what this skin is tattooed with is a storm so bad it eats the world, end quote. So here Lewis's inability to read the warning offered in the past prevents him from seeing the ongoing violence of the present. And so these instances of darkly ironic misapprehension are an effect of the men's internalization of colonial narratives, and this colonial dysgraphia renders characters unable to register the signs left behind by Elkhead woman. As such, we can also read these instances of misreading as acts of refusal, which again expose the limitations of settler encoding conventions. And so the final moment of refusal I want to discuss occurs in the novel's concluding section. Again, sorry I'm ruining the ending of this lovely novel. You should still go read it. And so the concluding section is called Sweat Lodge Massacre, in this sort of like fun horror movie titling that Stephen does. And so this is the segment where Elkhead woman exacts her final revenge as she murders Gabe and Cass, who are the last two men responsible for her and her calf's death. And then afterward, she actually turns her attention towards a character called Denora, who's Gabe's estranged daughter. And although deftly pursued, Denora manages to elude Elkhead woman, and eventually Denora's father-in-law arrives and manages to corner Elkhead woman. Yet when Denora's stepfather aims his rifle at Elkhead woman, Denora positions herself between the rifle's barrel and Elkhead woman and chooses to refuse the call for revenge. This is a long quote. So, Denora looks up that long hill into the winking scope and dead eye of her new dad. And then she looks to Elkhead woman, to the calf, and she sees now that both of her fathers have stood at the top of the slope behind a rifle, and that the elk have always been down there, and it can stop. It has to stop. The old man telling this in the Star Lodge, says to the children sitting all around him, "It has to stop," he says, brushing his stubby braids out of the way. And the girl, she knows this. She can feel it. And she can see her real dad dead in that burned down sweat lodge, the back of his head gone, but she can also see him up on the slope 10 years ago, shooting into a herd of elk that weren't his to shoot at, and she hates that he's dead. She loves him. She is him in every way that counts, but her new dad shooting the elk beside her isn't going to bring him back. So this is where the old man looks from face to face of the children in the lodge with him, a blanket of stars spread around them. This is where he says to all the children gathered in the fire, around the fire, that what the girl does here for Pinoka, the elk, but also for her whole tribe, what she does is slide forward onto her bloody knees, placing her small body between the rifle and the elk that killed her dad. She holds her right hand up, the slope, palm out, fingers spread. The old man demonstrates, and she says it clear in that cold air, "No, Dad, no." Is this the first time she's called him that? It is, the old man says. It is. There's a lot here. Denora realizes that in a situation where she can choose to let violence repeat itself, or she can refuse that possibility. It's a moment of radical kin-making, wherein she recognizes not only her relationship to the elk, but also to her stepfather. Her act of relationality in both instances exceeds the genealogical imperative. One can make kin beyond the logics of blood and even across modes of being. Denora sees that continuing violence against Elkhead woman will not restore justice, it will perpetuate imbalance. And so the only possibility for the future is to stop the violence, to prevent her father-in-law from reenacting the violence of her biological father, and from becoming an agent of colonialism's repetition. It's especially key to recognize that her feelings are mixed and that she expresses both love and hatred in this situation, and I can talk more about that. in Q&A. An earlier version of this focused on like love and rage, so I can talk about that later. But in this moment too, Denora realizes that bringing about justice is complex, difficult, and not always utopian, but it is necessary, and the story can be written another way. As Denora becomes aware of what she must do, a disruption occurs in the narrative, right? We get this like telescoping shift where the reader suddenly becomes aware that the story is also being told within a different context. There's like this weird simultaneity to the story all of a sudden. An Indigenous narrator is revealed, and this old man is telling the story in a different time, a different place, and a different context. And in this moment, the story of the Only Good Indians is revealed to be multi-temporal, functioning as a kind of warning which speaks to multiple contexts, places, and times. Formally, it's a refusal of a notion of a singular, linear Western temporality. And in this moment, the old man also makes clear that Denora's act to refuse violence is for Panoka, for the elk, but also for her whole tribe. And in this moment of the novel, refusal emerges as a way to disrupt colonialism's hierarchies of being, revealing that there are other ways to live, other kinds of stories we can tell. So I'm going to stop there. We can talk more about some of the things I've gestured to in Q&A. But I want to thank everyone for listening, and I look forward to our ensuing conversation.
So, hi everybody again. We're just going to give Callie a second to rest for a second, and as questions come up in the Q&A section, you can have this and take them, or I can give them to you. What do you prefer?
I don't know. You can read the questions.
Okay, I'll read the questions to you.
If I get confused, I might come over and look at them.
And if there's a role, I could ask any questions.
Cool.
So the questions, Josh, you just started hearing. Okay. Can people hear me? So, I just want to say thank you to Callie for that really great presentation. Thank you so much. And yeah, you had me thinking in a whole bunch of ways. And so I really appreciate it. And that book sounds really great. I should read it. And one of the things I was thinking about is maybe we should, I was thinking about Molly's presentation too, that maybe we should, read these 2 or 3 books whenever we do these presentations.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just kind of waiting. Josh, I'm not sure if I'm doing this right here.
They haven't posted it yet.
Okay. Okay.
Molly has a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That was great talk. I'm also thinking about a lot of things, but I'm wondering if you could do gestures toward being able to talk more about refusal and the paper that you got that from. I'm really interested. Can I hear more?
Yeah, so refusal comes out of Audra Simpson's book, Mohawk Interruptus. And so for her, basically she was conducting anthropological field work in her Kanawake community around questions of enrollment. So up in Canada, basically what happened is when the Indian Act got instated, which was sort of their big piece of native law, what happened was Indigenous women who married what's called up there non-status men, so what here would call maybe people not from federally recognized tribes, or if they married someone that wasn't Indigenous, they would lose their status. And so you would have women, right, that were members of the community that were sisters, and some of your sisters would be enrolled or have status and some of them wouldn't. And so she's thinking about that. She's thinking about, how the Kanawake Mohawks have this long history, right, of refusing the Canadian state. So up in Oka, their actions of of land protectors being we're not, you can't come on our land. She gives examples of people, a lot of these communities are across the US and Canada border. And so people will try to use their status cards to move in between these places, and border agents will be you can't use that. That's not a real thing. And so she's seeing all these acts of refusal, and then she's also seeing, in these conversations about enrollment and about status, they'll get to parts of the conversation where, like, the respondent that she's interviewing doesn't want to answer the question. And for her, what she learned in that experience, right, is there's like a point where this ethnographic method does something that's no longer helpful for the community. And like she can see it in the refusal of her respondents. And so for her, she takes up this method of refusal as like her way of writing this ethnography, to say like, I'm not going to write some of these things about the community, and I'm not going to talk about some of these things because they're not going to help us. And so for me, I think refusal is really generative in that, like, I'm not going to talk about this, but it's also like, and I'm going to talk about all of these other things that are just as useful and helpful, and even more generative in moving Indigenous people towards, like, our futures we want. Does that help? It's good. It's such a rad piece of work.
So we have a question.
Yay.
And it's Ted.
Hi, Ted.
Hi, Ted. I think people can hear you. But so the question is, looking at refusal, the last two paragraphs, I think that you showed us, and refute the whole end of the trail trope. Did you find other popular culture moments like this in the work?
Refuse. I don't know what he means by the end of the trail trope. What do you mean by the end of the trail trope, Ted?
The final two of the book itself, final two paragraphs of the book itself. I'm also, we're not, we need clarity on the question, Ted. I'm sorry. If you want to elaborate later, we can do it. I can go to the next question. So, Maud Hines has a question. And then Maud says, I'll ask the question about love and hate and rage. In their relationship, is their relationship dialectical, or how do these feelings relate to one another? Alternatively, please say anything you like about love and hate, love and rage.
Yeah, so to sort of contextualize this talk, like, it was originally a dissertation chapter that I'm like taking out of the book, because the book I've decided to just focus on like settler representations of Indigenous peoples in horror, because I think just like all of these wonderful Indigenous works are coming out that I feel like I have to like work in capacity with them. So originally when I wrote the chapter, the dissertation was all about revenge, and how a lot of narratives about Indigenous people, specifically Indigenous resistance, that are written by settlers get cast as these like revenge narratives, like the Indian burial ground trope, like all this like clear cut, like Native people and their resistance are just out for revenge, right? And so I was thinking about the affects that like drive that. And so in the dissertation chapter, I talked about a lot about love and rage, and how that sort of is embodied both by Elkhead Woman, because like, right, the reason that she chooses to take revenge is because she's like something she loves has been taken from her. So I was writing about that. I was also writing about Rachel Flowers' work. Rachel Flowers has this really wonderful essay called The Refusal to Forgive, where she's critiquing like the language of reconciliation, where it's like reconciliation starts supposedly when like all of us natives like forgive the settler state, and only after that forgiveness occurs can we move out of our like negative affect into this. And what happens, right, and what she says is like a lot of, especially Indigenous women's critiques of the state get re-encoded through like the language of love, where it's like they're doing these actions out of love for the community, which is correct, but we're also really like pissed off about stuff. And so to sort of relegate, right, when we get to the problem with revenge narratives, right, is that it like relegates all our affect to like rage. And the part of the wrong thing that's wrong with reconciliation is that like tries to relegate all of our affects to like love. And for us, there's no separating it, right? And so both are sort of a way of corralling Indigenous responses into these like affective conventions, or like these sort of inscribed conventions. So I talked a lot about that. I had a whole section too where I critiqued new materialism. that I omitted because, new materialist feminists are like all of the good feelings that we have with the environment, and that's what should propel our work. Whereas, like, for Indigenous people, like, the environment's scary. Like, other beings are scary and will hurt us. And that doesn't mean that we're not in relationship with them. It just means that, like, we are in a certain kind of relationship with them that's not necessarily all about, like, good, wonderful stuff. It's, like, about struggle, right? And that's what I really like about this novel, is that it, like, shows, like, elk communities are their own thing, and, like, we have to negotiate that difference. It's sort of like, it reminds me, there's that, like, moment in Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man, where they're, like, interviewing the one native guy, and the one native guy's like, we don't hang out with bears because they'll like murder you. And that's like that's encoded right into our relations that we have with other than human beings. And so to try to, like, corral it into one or the other just doesn't work. And so I think that's another one of the refusals that this text enacts, is that relegating like positive affects from negative affects. Like, we have both all the time, and that's, like, what makes our search for justice, like, productive, because we're okay with the discomfort of rage and love together.
So Maud, thank you for your question.
Yeah.
And I thanks for letting it be like whatever Kelly wanted to do. Can I kind of just follow up and I'll try to have a conversation.
Yeah.
I can fall on my face. But so I was thinking that it's impossible kind of to resolve, like, the young, I think the daughters, she loves her dad and her stepdad, and then there's hate and rage there too. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of going, I'm thinking of myself personally in this case, where, I grew up with two parents who, I would call, so my dad was black and my mom was white. And my dad was, a full, like an integrationist, right? And my mom was too, right? And so I was thinking, like, as I've grown up, I'm like, well, I have rage towards them because I was like, you kind of set me up for some stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I deeply love my parents because they cared for me and, they were gentle with me, right? Mm-hmm. So I've got, like, love, and I also have anger, maybe rage, I don't know if I'd say rage, but something like, but I feel like I feel like that's unresolvable. Mm-hmm. And that's just it. Mm-hmm. I can't do anything more. I got to live with that. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if I saw that here in the young girls kind of. I just can't. There's nothing I have to live with that. Mm-hmm. Maybe just saying it is, but I was just thinking about that, and I know I have another kind of question that I wanted to pose, but I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, like, I think part of, like, I'm in the same situation. Like, my mom's Native, my dad's white, and, like, I understand, like, the reason my mom thought certain ways about stuff, right, is, like, these colonial constraints. And so that's, like, where you can't, this type of rage or anger that you feel in those situations is very different, because you can see the whole picture, right? You can see the way that they were sort of constrained by these systems, and that's where those things come from, right? And I think that's what's happening here with Denora too, right? Is she knows, like, the reason that her dad ended up so messed up, right, is because the world hates Indigenous men and wants to kill them. And so that's their love and the rage, right? Is you can be frustrated that your parents bought into it, but you can also see that, like, in many cases there's, like, no other ways, or, like, the weight of having to resist that is really heavy. So, yeah.
So Ted he's come back and he said a few things, so I'll go over his, I think he's trying to clarify his question. So he said, and I'm going to come back to some of this too. So looking at refusal, the last two paragraphs refute the whole end of the trail trope. Did you find other popular cultural moments like this in the work? Then he says, I'm referring to the final two, I guess, paragraphs of the book itself. It's not the end of the trail, then he has in quotes, it's not the end of the trail, the headlines will say. It never was the end of the trail. It's the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm lost. I don't know if you're going. Where you go. Referencing settler favorite sculpture, End of the Trail, with what we take to be America's last Indian, slumped over their horse, dying into the past, or the West, or whatever their imagination would like to control.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know that. I didn't know that was an allusion. Thanks, Ted. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like I think that's the part of the whole gist of the argument, right? Is that there's a lot that's been written about Stephen Graham Jones, right, where he's like resisting horror conventions, and it's like it's hard to place his work within like discrete generic categories. And I think part of that is like a fundamental difference of like what Indigenous horror tries to do. And an inability for it to be sort of placed within like any sort of genre concretely, which is why I like it. and it makes sense in terms of like, right, we've talked about all the stuff, right, about like recognition and blood quantum. Like it makes sense that like we don't want to think in those terms. So yeah, I think like broadly, right, the text is this sort of like slasher revenge narrative that refuses in the conclusion to conform to those conventions, right? Because like the end of it, like to draw an illusion that I know of. So like the end of the Halloween movie, right? Like Laurie Strode like reacts to and tries to kill Michael Myers, or like Nightmare on Elm Street, like the final girl part of her turn, right, is that she adopts a very, very similar positionality, right, to the monster. And this is the opposite of that, where she's like, no, like just inverting, to sort of allude to a conversation I had with students, like, right, inverting these positions doesn't fix it. It's a matter of like eliminating these positions altogether. So I think that's another, like broadly, like that's what the text is doing too. And why I like it so much, and why I was like waiting for a slasher like this, and his new book too. So yeah. Hope that answered your question.
So I'm gonna ask this question. So Maureen Howell, I think it's kind of more comment, or yeah, it's just, I sometimes assign Flowers' essay in my classes. Students are challenged and moved by it. They find deeper understandings of issues of forgiveness because of what Flowers discusses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, right, like the quote that I have, I think I have it memorized now, right? Forgiveness is a singular act that forgives a singular act. And so what does it mean for reconciliation to try to forgive a whole structure, right? Like, then we start talking about like, what does justice look like when you can't forgive? And then we're gonna be like, oh no, this is scary, right? But I think like that, like, being able to dwell, and I'm okay with like dwelling in negative affects, which maybe makes sense why I talk about horror and monsters and terrifying things. Yeah. But I think that's what we have to remember, right? Is like the bringing about justice doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of negative affects. It just means like making the world more just. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Great. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next question. Francis Hampton. Can refusal be suggested when not wanting to accept land acknowledgement without calls of action? As a Native person, land acknowledgements mean to me that people are now willing to acknowledge what happened to Native people. Happens to, but that's just not enough at this point. Excuse me. By acknowledging it on this scale, a movement is good if change is attached, and if not, I find it almost disorienting as opening statements, because it gives me a negative affect and takes my thoughts to the needs of my people. This happens when we have almost all meetings at PSU with a land acknowledgement. So though it's useful for people to understand Native people, for me, being reminded fires me up, rage out. it makes me almost in refusal of the land acknowledgement without a call of action as part of the framework, which is not always seen.
Yeah, that's like I was watching, like, again, so like shout out to Kutch Rosenbald, who's like an amazing Hoopa scholar. She has like a really good talk on land acknowledgements and how she does it, and yeah, she talks about, you know, doing the work of like including place names, which I've tried to start doing, and yeah, the accompanying call to action, right? Because like that's the problem that Francis is articulating, right? Is we get the land acknowledgement. I guess I could go back to it. We get like all the stuff of like people were here and they did sacrifices, right? And that's good, right? And that's necessary. And I want to acknowledge too, right, that like, you know, for me as an uninvited guest, Indigenous guest here, right, like I want to include the language that the communities generate, because like they did that and they're asking for us to do that. But I think, yeah, part of it is, right, like we get the land acknowledgement and then everyone says, well, what do we do? And so having that concrete action of like, go do this. And Kutch even talks about like when she started doing this, she was like she was real aggressive about it, and she'd be like, I'll wait until all of us pull this up and donate or do the thing, right? And also I think what's important too is that she adjusts it to whatever place she's in. So like she's been in some places and her call to action has been to donate to local BLM efforts, right? And so, yeah, I think, for me, I think having the accompanying call to action sort of moves us past, yeah, just, like I said, it's important, like, it's like the two-phase, like, thing of refusal, right? Where it's like we have to acknowledge the things, and then we have to start storing something else different. And so I think this is sort of trying to do both, I hope.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll speak to a couple of those. Let me switch to the other microphone so you can hear me better. Bear with me here. Hopefully folks can hear me. So Dr. Faliafa asked, can you talk more about intent and intentionality in refusal? Also choosing instead to persist in Indigenous narratives and actions.
So like the difference between intent and intention. Yeah. I mean, I can start there, like, I don't know. I think we're all to the point, right, where we know that, like, you can intend, like, again, we'll go to the land acknowledgement. Like, the intention of the land acknowledgement is good, but it doesn't necessarily achieve the things that we want. And again, that's, like, for me, one of the problems around affect, right? And especially my critique of new materialism that I've dragged in here. Is that right? They're like, if we emphasize and focus on like good affects and positivity and like all of the good things, that whatever makes us feel like that will necessitate that the work that we're doing is good. And again, that for me, it's like, okay, that's like one of those conventions, right? That's blocking us from doing something else and from imagining something else. And so, yeah, part of it is part of, I think, you know, getting through colonial dysgraphia, right, and like anti-Black dysgraphia, is making those things visible, the way that like intention and positive affect can construct certain kinds of conventions, right? And then the other part of the question was dwelling in.
So, also choosing instead to persist in Indigenous narratives and actions. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's. I think like that's where refusal gets really interesting, right? Is because refusal for Simpson, right? She's like writing about her community and realizes that like there's something she doesn't need to story, and that's like an interesting relationship, right, to Indigenous storying and like existing in those narratives. But like what Tuck and Yang say, right, is that part of that can be, you know, we're not going to share these stories with you, we're not going to share this knowledge with you, and part of it. And then then to go back to intentionality, right? Like some folks will be like, well, why do you want to, what are your intentions of not sharing this with us? I don't know, as like a Lakota person and like someone who engages Native Lit, I just know that like some things aren't for me and I don't get upset about that. And so, yeah, I don't know, that's my rambly answer in response to that, right? Is like, I don't know, it again goes back to all these ways that like, one of the ways of like that settler colonialism is like sort of producing this dysgraphia is it's like policing the way our feelings are felt and written. And so, yeah, I think intention is one of those affects that like gets weaponized in really troubling ways. So.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another one here. Let me switch microphones. So, Dr. Kai Ching asked, thank you, Kaylee, for this great talk. I am interested in the theory of time. Can you say a little bit more about your theorization of indigenous temporarity in relation to rage and reconciliation in Jones's novel?
Yeah, thank you, Kai. You must know how much I hang out with my mentor, Mark Minch DeLeo, because this is all we talk about is like temporality, right? This is where I got this from. So like another one of colonialism's conventions, right, is this like linear notion of history, where it's like there's a series of actions and responses, and the implication being like we're progressing from, bad stuff inevitably towards good stuff. And for me, one of the things I try to, one of the things that really interests me when I think about indigenous storytelling and genre is like, there's this Western thing genre, right, where it's like horror movies are supposed to have this stuff in it. And it's like these elements that are put together and repeated over and over again. And that's like what genre is. Where in indigenous storytelling, like sometimes we'll just literally tell the same story over and over again. And so for me, how is that a different relationship to genre? And how is that a different relationship to temporality? Because I think like the really awesome special thing about a lot of indigenous stories is that they speak to multiple temporalities. So again, in an earlier version of this talk, I also talked about Jeff Barnaby's Rhymes for Young Ghouls. And there, in that film, there's like this story, right, that's like this moment with the skin, right, where it's a story that is told with these like sci-fi, conventions, but it's about the past, it's about the present, and it's about the future. And I think this is also another one of those moments that appear in Native Lit that are like, so there's another one in Louise Erdrich's The Roundhouse, one of these stories. And it's like a lot of indigenous stories have this like funky temporality that's like amazing and makes me so excited, is that they can speak to they come from a different temporality, but they're continuing to speak out the present and they're continuing to warn about the future, right? And so that's, I don't know, temporality's wild. And this is my sort of way of trying to like capture some of that sense of like multiplicity, right? Sometimes when I teach stories to students, I'll be like, when do you think this was written? And I'll be like, is this a future story? Is this a past story? Is this a present story? When I teach out in Arjwat, the fast runner, that's like a way I teach that, right? Is like, is this a story about the present, or is it some other place or some other time? And so that ending moment too, where it like zooms out and you realize like that there's someone else that's been telling this story this whole time, gives the whole novel this like really sort of prophetic and sort of commemorative quality simultaneously. That's like I'm trying to figure out. But yeah.
Well,
So there's one more question.
Is there one more?
Can we read it?
Yeah.
So Donnie asked, you mentioned the radical kin making. Is this a phrase that Kaylee said is original? It is very powerful. Can you say more on this idea and its relation to refusal?
Yeah. I think a lot of my recent thoughts about kin making come out of Zoe Todd's work. Zoe Todd's like this wonderful Métis scholar. And likewise, like Chris Anderson's work is like a wonderful Métis scholar. And so it's different than, I won't say that. I was going to say it's different from this other theorist's perspective of making kin, but I think we can all guess who that is. Right, like, yeah, for me, I think what I find, again, really compelling about this novel is that there's all of these sort of comparisons that are developed between like the 4 men who kill the herd of elk and Elkhead woman. But it's not a sort of like the traditional sort of Western way of reading that, right, is like the men are being animalized because they're being compared to this animal, right? And I don't think that's what's going on at the novel at all. I think what it's showing, right, is that like just like human beings, we can fall into patterns of revenge and like pull things out of balance. Elkhead woman is susceptible to that too. And so to me, that sort of like helps break down this binary that the West has imposed upon us to be like humans are better than animals because we have reason and logic, right? And indigenous epistemologies are like, no, like animals have reason and logic and agency. Mountains have reason and logic and agency, right? Or what we would, something parallel to what we would call that. That's probably like an equivocation, right? And also just remembering too that like a lot of indigenous origin stories say that like human beings came into the world last. So we're like the goofballs trying to figure out like how the world works. Because everyone's been here a lot longer than us and has sorted stuff out, right? And so, yeah, so like the idea of Denora sort of refusing that hierarchy of refusing to say like, and buy into this idea that like we, humans have the right to dominate animals, even when they've like pulled things out of balance, right? Is this sort of, for me, like this radical reorientation, right, of our relationality. And again, it's not about like, I don't think it's about like animalizing humans or humanizing animals. I think it's just a way to sort of, it's a refusal of that sort of language, I guess, to go back to that language of refusal, right? So.
All right, I'm gonna give Callie a break.
Yay!
I want to say thank you so much. That was a really, really just deep presentation and made me think about so many things. I have so many questions, and I would encourage you to follow up with yours to Callie. So again, I want to just thank you all for being there, and I'm looking forward to our next one next month. This is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.